Hey, what's going on, everyone? And welcome to episode 61 of the Alec Walt Show. I'm your host, Alec Walt, alongside another very special guest. And today, we're talking about the NFL draft. One team that had two top 10 picks in this past weekend's draft was the New York Giants. And joining me to recap the New York Giants draft and more is Lance Medow, the pregame and postgame radio broadcaster. Lance, what's going on, man? I appreciate you joining me.
Hey, not a problem, Alec. I appreciate you having me on the show. Everything's going well. How about you?
It's going well here, man. You know, my team picked a little bit later. I figured I'd contact someone with a team that had a little more excitement here in the 2022 NFL draft. And it's crazy to think that the Giants left with not one, but two names who were discussed as potential number one overall picks just a few months ago. Let's start with number 5, Lance. I mean, everyone was in love with Kayvon Thibodeaux in the pre-draft process. He fell a little bit in the draft, but you guys got him at number 5 and didn't need to move one spot to land the premier edge rusher in the 2022 draft. What was your reaction when you saw him on the board, and what are your thoughts on him joining the Giants?
Well, I don't know if it was that much of a surprise that he was still there at 5, because if you remember, Alec, there was a lot of talk leading up to the draft that teams were turned off by him because of his personality and the fact that maybe that would not be something they'd want to bring into a locker room because he has such, if you listen to him, he's going to be able to handle the New York media with ease. This guy loves to talk, so that's never going to be a problem. And I think that's maybe why he fell. It really had nothing to do with X's and O's, his pure talent and upside. I think that speaks for itself. You see what he did at Oregon. It was more of, is he the right fit for our organization? So I figured he could very well be in the mix at 5 for the Giants. And I think the way Joe Schoen played it out, and when he spoke to the media after the fact, he explained they thought, Alec, there was a significant drop-off at pass rusher following Kayvon Thibodeaux. But they didn't feel the same way about the offensive line, meaning they felt there were a few guys in the same ballpark. So I think with Carolina in the middle, and you never knew really what the Panthers were going to do. Would they have gone after a quarterback? Would they grab an offensive lineman? I think their thinking was, let's grab the position where we're worried if Thibodeau's not there, then we're not going to get someone of equal value, and then roll the dice a little bit with respect to the offensive line. So from that standpoint, it played out very well. But the Giants needed a pass rusher, getting back to number 5. They only had 34 sacks in 2021. It was an area of concern. They have youth there, so you give themselves Thibodeaux, you give yourself Ojulari from last year, and you got two bookends who are going to continue to grow within Wink Martindale's defense. And you hope that Leonard Williams' presence opens things up for them and vice versa.
Yeah, Wink Martindale was an awesome signing for you guys. It doesn't really get talked about as much with some of the other movement going on. But how do you think Thibodeaux, Wink's a guy who loves to use versatility. He's a guy who is going to line up people in multiple spots. How do you see him translating to the Wink Martindale defense?
Well, Martindale loves to blitz. Alec, if you look at the statistics
Bingo.
during his Baltimore tenure, he's 1 or 2 in the NFL in terms of blitz rate. So anytime you could get somebody that has a knack for getting after the quarterback, I think that plays right into his hands. But let's not forget, in Wink Martindale's defense, he also leaves his cornerbacks out on an island. He loves those guys to cover. So the reason I'm bringing that up is if you're blitz heavy and you're aggressive, if those guys don't get home and they don't finish, you're putting your secondary in a very tough spot. So it still falls on the onus of the guys on the back end to be able to cover. But getting back to your question about what Thibodeaux does for his defense, you're going to believe that he's going to win his one-on-one battles when given the opportunities. You can move him around a little bit. And the other thing with Thibodeaux is the ability to help stop the run. And let's not overlook that. I think when we look at pass rushers, Alec, we focus on getting to the quarterback, applying pressure. But you need your pass rushers en route to getting to the quarterback to be able to stop the run, or some of the downs when you keep him on the field for him to assist in that department. And Thibodeaux's been exposed to that. So to me, that's just as important as how many sacks he's going to get in year 1.
So you guys also had another top 10 pick at number 7. Evan Neal, the offensive tackle, was selected out of Alabama. This guy is an absolute monster. If you guys have not watched any Alabama games, he's 6'8", 337 pounds, likely going to play right tackle alongside Andrew Thomas, is going to play on the left, another early draft pick over a few years ago. That's a pretty solid young tackle duo there for the Giants. So what are your thoughts on Neal coming into the organization?
Well, I go back to what I said with respect to Joe Shane's philosophy. I think the way it played out, they were able to get one of the top tackles in the draft. And right tackle was a specific need because Nate Solder left via free agency. His contract expired. And then Matt Payert, who also played a little bit there, tore his ACL late in the season. So he's a question mark about when he's going to return this year. They knew they had to solidify that spot. And you bring in a player who played right tackle. That's the other key. If you look at Ike Ekwonu as well as you look at Charles Cross, I think the difference between those two, Alec, versus Neal is Neal on film, you see what he did at right tackle. He played left tackle last season, but he had a season at right, and then he also has experience at guard. So the versatility, I think, is appealing. Not to say that they want to move him around. They made it clear. It's going to start out at right tackle, but you know, Alec, how the NFL plays out. You suffer an injury during the season, maybe you can move him around if that gives you an opportunity to get another tackle on the field by maximizing the top 5 guys out there at once. I think that's the goal for any team. But you mentioned Andrew Thomas. Okay, now you have 2 guys who you drafted within the last 3 years out of the SEC who you can build with together and you can have grow simultaneously because they're both still relatively young. And I think that's what any team looks for. Neal also is a presence. You mentioned how big he is. It's amazing to me. He says he's comfortable playing around that 340, 345 range. But if you look at him, he doesn't look like a guy that carries a lot of weight. He's actually very lean.
Yeah.
So to me, it's quite amazing, his measurements, because it doesn't jump off when you actually look at him from a physical standpoint. But he plays with a lot of power. And because of his length, it's going to be difficult for the big boys on the opposite side of the ball to try to get around him to get after the quarterback. So to me, it was a good combination of you met need and you brought in a guy who was clearly one of the top-ranked offensive linemen. So I think that's a win-win, at least as it appears on paper.
When you talk about size, this guy isn't the biggest receiver from the 2022 class, but in the second round, you guys had the 11th pick in the second round. Wandale Robinson was the pick out of Kentucky. Now, there is the debate about which receiver the Giants should have taken with that selection, and he's also a slot receiver who you guys prioritized in the first round of last year's draft. But for this pick with Wandale Robinson, how do you think he transitions into the Giants offense, and what does this do for the current receivers on the roster?
Well, that last question, let me attack that first because I think that's what a lot of people are asking with respect to what it means for the receiving core. You can't go into this year if you're the Giants banking on all of them playing a bulk of the games. I mean, let's look at the layout of the land here, Alec. Kenny Golladay was banged up last season, and he's more of a taller receiver. Tony barely got on the field as a rookie. You saw some flashes here or there. You didn't see much of anything beyond that. Darius Slayton has dealt with injuries, and Sterling Shepard, who they reconfigured his contract, he's another one that has injury history. So when people say, well, this is like a duplication of Sterling Shepard and Kadarius Toney, can you guarantee me that those 3 guys are going to all be able to play 15 games? If the answer is no, then you're really not duplicating things. All you're doing is you're looking to bring in another playmaker. And that's exactly what Wandale Robinson is. If you look at how he was utilized, you get him out in open space, he's going to do damage because he's very difficult to bring down. And you could use him out of the backfield as a running back. He actually set all types of records at Kentucky this past season in terms of receiving yards, receptions, and receiving touchdowns. So for a guy that wasn't a vertical threat, which is I think what you were alluding to, he still found a knack to get the ball and find the end zone. So I look at him as a playmaker. And to answer your first question, the way he fits in is Brian Dable's offense, and then we'll add Mike Kafka into the mix because he comes over from the Chiefs as the offensive coordinator. If you look at the personnel they had, I mean, think about Kansas City, right? Kansas City wasn't, we're going to throw the ball 50, 60 yards down the field and hope something happens. Tyreek Hill, get him out in open space. Let him do the heavy lifting after that. The running backs with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Pringle, another wide receiver. These weren't necessarily all deep threats. Don't get me wrong. Tyreek Hill, they threw the ball deep down the field, but often they also gave him a 6-yard pass, and then he went 50 yards with the football. Buffalo, Cole Beasley, Isaiah McKenzie. Those were also guys they got out into open space. So I think the way you look at the style of those two offenses, they don't necessarily bank on the home run hitters. And I think that's where Rondell Robinson, to answer your question, fits in. It puts another playmaker on the field, somebody that Daniel Jones can dump the ball off to and allow them to then do the heavy lifting. Because remember, part of this pick to me, Alec, is also not just how they fit in to the Chiefs and Bills style of offense, but not allowing Daniel Jones to hold on to the ball and put himself in a precarious spot where he's going to be hit. Regardless of how you feel about the offensive line and whether or not that unit is going to make strides, you can't assume that. You still need to find ways for Daniel Jones not to hold on to the ball. And I think Robinson fits into that equation.
We mentioned the offensive line. Neal wasn't the only offensive lineman taken in this class by the Giants in the third round. Pretty early in the draft, you guys drafted Joshua Ezeudu, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, out of North Carolina, an offensive guard. Not only did you guys get someone on the outside, you have someone on the interior of your offensive line. What do you think of the plan of attack here with getting an interior offensive lineman for the Giants?
Well, first of all, the pronunciation was beautifully executed. It was crisp.
Awesome.
It flowed right off the tongue. So we have to make sure we emphasize that, Alec. Clearly, you've been studying, you've been doing your homework, you've been practicing your linguistics. So kudos to you. In all seriousness, though, in terms of your question, Ezeudu, the appeal of him is, Alec, if you're going to take an offensive lineman in the mid to late rounds, to me, the one common element has to be versatility. Because if they're going to be a backup offensive lineman, and Ezeudu, I think, will compete for left guard, but I think Max Garcia, the veteran they brought in from Arizona, is probably more in the driver's seat. And then Shane Lemieux, who they drafted 2 years ago, is another player. So Ezeudu, if he's going to get opportunities on the field in all likelihood in year one, they're going to mix and match. And the fact that he's been exposed to both guard positions and both tackle positions, heck, in a game, he actually played two different positions in one series. That's how versatile he is. So that, to me, is why he's an appealing pick, because if you dress 3 or 4 extra offensive linemen, you don't have the luxury of having a backup for all 5 positions. You have to have one guy that could play multiple spots. So that, to me, is why it makes sense to go after a guy like that. And the other thing is, he comes from an offense in North Carolina that was very run heavy. 2 years ago, they had Javonte Williams and they had Michael Carter. So those two guys, if you go back, they flourished. He was a big part of that. So when you take into consideration, he's been exposed to run blocking. I think he'll improve as it moves along as a pass protector. But you've got somebody that, once again, I think shows that he can play multiple positions. He could be a backup. He could be a starter. And he could compete for a job. And that's what you look for when you're going to take an offensive lineman out of the first 2 rounds.
So obviously offensive line was an area of focus at the draft and in free agency. I mean, you look at the Giants depth chart, you're seeing a lot of new names. There still potentially could be some other moves made here on the offensive line. But after the draft, what are your just thoughts on the approach that Shane has taken with addressing the need on the roster?
Well, the approach was to pretty much revamp the position.
Yeah.
I think that's where they went, Alec. Give you a specific number, there's 9 new offensive linemen that they added between the draft and free agency. And clearly, that's been the Achilles heel of the team. Make no mistake about it, over the last few seasons, whether it be pass protection, run blocking, however you want to look at it. Though I do think they were a better unit in run blocking over the last few years, and they probably don't get enough credit for that. But pass protection was certainly an issue. And let's not overlook, I know this is a little bit off topic, but Daniel Jones staying healthy is still a key component in all of this, regardless of who you're throwing out there. He's missed at least 2 starts each of his first 3 seasons. Alec, he's got to stay healthy this year.
Yeah.
Because if he doesn't, then all of a sudden you're still questioning, well, what do you have in the quarterback? But with respect to the offensive line, there's a bunch of new bodies in the mix, for the lack of a better phrase. You brought in John Feliciano in free agency, who is now going to transition to a new position 24/7 at center. He's played it a little bit, but he was mainly a guard. You brought in Mark Lewinsky, who you're going to play at right guard, a veteran from the Indianapolis Colts. We talked about the bookends in Andrew Thomas and Evan Neal, who you drafted in the last 3 years. And then, like I said, left guard is the position which is a little bit opened right now. Max Garcia, veteran free agent, Shane Lemieux, and then I wouldn't remove Josh Azudu, who I think is certainly going to compete. But right there, if you look at last year's offensive line, Alec, just to spell out my point here, the only player in that group that started last year was Andrew Thomas. That's it. So the backups this year are some players that started last year and also are new players. And whenever I think if you're a team, and Buffalo did a very similar thing. That's why I'm not surprised, because where did Joe Shane come from? Came from Buffalo. 2019, when he was the assistant GM, they revamped their offensive line. And if you go back and you look, they did it with a little mixing and matching, the draft and free agency. But Josh Allen was running for his life in 2018 as a rookie. Then he comes into 2019. He has a lot of new offensive linemen. You saw him take the next step forward. So I think the approach, it's not identical because Daniel Jones is not Josh Allen. Let me make that clear. And the offensive linemen are different. But the philosophy is, if we improve the guys up front and Daniel Jones can remain durable, maybe now he could take the next step as a quarterback.
So 7 other players were drafted by the Giants in the 2022 NFL draft that we have not mentioned. Lance, instead of going through those 7 names of the later round picks in the draft, who are some guys you left impressed with?
Well, I'm bringing up my list just to make sure that I don't miss out on anybody. As far as, to answer your question, the individuals that maybe are sleepers or I think have some upside, one guy that jumps out to me is their 5th-round pick, Micah Mcfadden, the linebacker out of Indiana. First of all, Alec, that met a need because Blake Martinez, remember, is coming off a season-ending injury with the torn ACL. Not to say that he won't be ready to go, but I think you need some insurance. The appeal of McFadden is McFadden was a heavy blitzer, a guy that not only helped stop the run, but got after the quarterback. He actually had 12 and a half sacks in his last 2 seasons combined at Indiana. So that's appealing, in addition to the fact that he led Indiana in tackles and tackles for loss, which is what you like to see out of a linebacker. So that, I think, is one player that falls under the umbrella of appeal and somebody that could come in and not just be a special teamer, but maybe get on the field a little bit in year 1. The second guy is Dane Belton, 1 round prior, who they picked out of Iowa, the safety. He's also a jack-of-all-trades type of player. He actually was opportunistic last season. He had 5 interceptions. If we go back to Wink Martindale's defense and also the safeties that they currently have on the roster, versatility is a big theme. And this gets back to what they did on the offensive line and on the defensive front. They want guys who they can mix and match. They want guys who they can move around. Well, Belton, he did exactly that. He played sort of a hybrid position in college where he was a bit safety and a bit outside linebacker. I'm not saying that the Giants have any plans to play him at outside linebacker, but the reason I bring him up is it reminds me a little bit of Xavier McKinney out of Alabama, who they drafted in the 2nd round a few years ago. What was McKinney's appeal? Well, Alabama moved him around. They didn't necessarily play him in one spot. And I think between him and Belton, this is where Martindale could be creative. He wants to bring some of the guys down into the box. He could do that. He wants to keep him as a deep safety. He could do that as well, because I think they have experience in both departments. So those 2 players in particular, they jump out to me. And Darrian Beavers, their 6th-round pick, is another guy who transferred from UConn in going to Cincy, but he played defensive end, linebacker, everywhere. So there's another guy that if you're going to make the team number 1, you have to be able to play multiple spots. Also, he was a special teamer. That, to me, was a theme in this draft. They looked at guys and they said to themselves, Alec, if we're going to take you in the 4th, 5th, or 6th rounds, you better not be able to play one position. You better not be comfortable in one spot, because if we're going to put you on the 53-man roster, we're going to expect you to be able to be moved around and be that eclectic, versatile player. And all 3 of those players, I think, fit that bill.
Awesome. Well, Lance, before I let you go, how can our listeners here keep in touch with you on social media and listen to some of your shows with the Giants and on SiriusXM Radio?
How much time do we have left in the show for me to get through the entire list?
All you need, man.
Well, first of all, with respect to the Giants, on Giants.com, we have a daily talk show, Big Blue Kickoff Live. It's on weekdays from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern. They could also check out the archives on their favorite podcast platform at Giants.com. And then during the season, on the Giants radio network is their pre-half and post-game show host. So that's with respect to the Giants. And then on Sirius XM, I host shows on Mad Dog Sports Radio, Channel 82, Saturdays and Sundays, 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern, talk all sports there. And then I'm on a various amount of shows on Sirius XM NFL Radio on Channel 88, where, of course, we cover the Giants, but most importantly, the entire league as a whole. So those are the main two platforms in terms of at least sports talk.
All right, Lance. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join me here on the Alec Walt Show.
You got it, Alec. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on the program.
All right, well, that's going to be it for this episode of the Alec Walt Show. I'm Alec Walt alongside Lance Medow. What do you think of the New York Giants draft selections? Feel free to give me your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more of my exclusive content. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you very soon.